Welcome back to Desktop Publishing with QuarkXPress. My name is Martin Turner. Today we're going to talk about adaptive scaling. Now, we looked at adaptive scaling a couple of weeks ago very briefly when we looked at duplicating a layout by just control click on that, alt click, right click rather, go to duplicate, and you'll see we had apply adaptive scaling and we can duplicate to a print layout or a digital layout. We briefly touched on that, but now we're going to go into all the features. Well, we can do that from there, but we can actually apply adaptive scaling rather, without having to change layout. We're going to go to the scale palette, which is in window scale. So window scale, and as it is, this is just going to be a very simple scaling tool where we can set 110% and it will do that. And there we go. Or 90%, which will take us not quite back to the same thing, but close enough. And we can do that to the entire layout. It gives us some information here about the original size, the scaled size, and also we can lock it and we can set as percent or as units. So we can actually do this in millimeters. So if I want my layout to be exactly 100 millimeters high, then I can scale that let's try that again, 100 millimeters high, I can scale that and there it goes. But if you click on here, you see you've got a kind of bump increase size, bump decrease size, but it's the scale settings which are the real power here. These are the same settings you're going to see if you do duplicate layout. So let's just go to duplicate layout, control or right click duplicate. Options for adaptive scaling, they're exactly the same settings, although you will find that a couple maybe grayed out. Well, let's come to them over here for a second. So scale settings, general. If I've got columns, if I'm scaling a page, the whole layout, I can scale the gutter width, the page grid, and the margins. If we go to layout properties, so a lot of layout properties, we're going to go to duplicate, and I could actually have done that to layout properties by changing the size, but I'm not going to. I'm going to change this to an A3 layout. Should we do that? I'm going to apply adaptive scaling. So options, I'm going to scale the gutter width and the margins, okay? So just cancel that for a second. We'll do F7 so we can see where those margins are. So at the moment, if I go to page display master and master guides and grids, I will see my margins are 27, 27, 27, and 27. Cancel that. Come back to display the regular page itself, and I'm now going to go to duplicate layout. I'm going to go to A3 and options. I'm going to scale the margin, and off we go. And what you see now is that these pages look identical, but they're not. Because if you now look at this margin, layout properties, those margins are, as you can see, 38, 38, 38, and 38. Now A4 and A3, of course, are identically proportionate. Let's delete that one for a second. So this time we're going to do the same thing, but we are going to go to A4 landscape. See what happens. So this time, you see that my margins have scaled quite differently. To retain the proportionality, I've now got narrow margins at the top, wider margins left and right. This is scaled so that it occupies the same basic vertical amount of space, but some of these elements have also been moved themselves. Now, you'll see that it's slightly confused in terms of the positioning. There will always be an issue there, but this block, which contains no content, has actually had its shape changed. You can see that there. Yeah. Okay, so let's come back to, let's delete that for a second. Come back to the original layout, and back to our options on scale settings. So I can scale the margin, scale the gutter width. I can also scale locked content or not scale it. So imagine that I have got something which I want to always be the same thing, whatever happens. Let's give that a color of cyan, and we're going to give that a 10%. And imagine I've always got that and don't want it to move. So I'm going to duplicate layout now, options, and I'm now going to scale lock content, no, scale locked items, no. And we're going to go to A4, I'm going to go to A3 actually. In fact, we'll even go to A5. I'm going to A5 portrait. Never works in demonstration. We'll stick with landscape. And you'll see that it's now changed the position on the page, but it's kept it at the same size. So if I've got an element which I want to keep the same, that's an important option to use. Okay, you can scale composition zones. Now, when we looked at composition zones, you may have noticed that you can't scale them. So if I create a composition zone of that, and now try to change its size, it won't let me. And even if I try to unlock it, it won't let me. Lock position, it's not locked, but it won't change. You can't scale it. Well, we can move it, but we can scale it with the scale tool. So scale settings, scale composition zones, yes. And now I'm going to go back to percent, and I'm going to say I want that at 90%, and scale, and it's changed. So the only way to scale composition zones once they're created is to use the scale tool. Okay, what else have we got here? Scale settings. So composition zones, we can scale the frame width, that's kind of obvious. We can scale run around outsets and all those things. We can also honor the box proportion lock, so that would normally be on. Let's come back to, let's again delete that one for a second. Actually, let's keep it. You'll see that the box proportions have changed there because they weren't locked. So if I now come to here and just click on my lock here, it's now going to lock that. And if I now duplicate the layout, and I'm going to change to A4 landscape, this time it's kept the lock on. So by default, that is turned on in scale settings, but it will only do something if your proportions are locked. By default, the proportions are locked for pictures and imported content, but they're unlocked for shapes that you make yourself. Well, okay, back to the screen. So what else have we got? Maintain proportions of non-rectangular boxes and so on. Now, text, this is where it gets really interesting, because on the text one, we can scale the box size, the text path length. So you see, just in passing, this is quite a complicated text path, and yet it's automatically scaled correctly. It doesn't kind of run off. We can grow the box to fit the text. Useful sometimes, usually turn it off. Now, we can scale character attributes. Yes, we usually do that. Horizontal and vertical scaling, are you employing that? I would recommend against it, but if you can change that. You can also set font size limits. So text is widely considered to be illegible below 6 point. It is definitely illegible below 4 point. And we might again say we want a minimum leading of 7 points. Okay, now we reduce this down to we're going to go to 20%. And we're going to scale that, wrong one, sorry, we're going to scale this text here. Let's actually just, oops, a little less there. We'll just make a copy of that, which we can bring over here. I'm going to scale that to 20%. And if we look at that now, we'll see that, okay, it's all higgledy-piggledy, but my text has retained its minimum size of 6 points. Clearly, you can't have text in the same proportions while specifying a minimum size once you go below that. But that's really, really useful, very important. Okay, now, what else? So we can set those limits, but synchronize box attributes and content. So this is not an option in the scaling palette, it's only an option in the main duplicate layout. Let's just get rid of those layouts for a second, because otherwise we're going to get confused by them. So delete that one. And so what we're going to do is we're going to come back to here and duplicate, and we're going to say A3. I'm going to go to my options and I'm going to say text, synchronize box content, attributes and content. Now, we saw this option when we were doing the same thing with the HTML5. So if I now go to Socrates is a Greek, all Greeks are human, therefore Socrates is human, which is a common logic puzzle. Is this a syllogism or isn't it? And I'm going to say that Socrates, yeah, that's better. Socrates is not Roman. All Romans are human. Therefore, Socrates is inhuman, which is, of course, is false logic. If you think that's correct, then you have a problem with your logic. And if I now go back to here, you'll see that this has changed automatically. Great. Well, okay, this should bring us to a different window, which is the content window, because you'll now see that these things have magically appeared in your content window. And if I now drag that across there, so this text item here, that's that text item. So now I want the other one. I want this one. No, it's this one. Okay. Socrates is not Roman, all Romans are human, therefore Socrates is inhuman. Now, if you're struggling with working on text on a line, this kind of shared content is very useful indeed. So we've got Socrates is not Roman, and maybe that's going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And I want to get rid of that stroke text, or I'm going to call it stoked text, or outline text. Or maybe I've got the whole thing in a different language and I want to just work it through. All that is in the shared content. Now, if I go to this and delete that shared content, it says, do you want to delete the shared content? All instances of this item will remain in the project, but they will be unsynchronized. Okay, so I'm now unsynchronizing it, but I'm not deleting it. So if I now go to here you'll see it's still there, but if I now change that, it doesn't change over here. Okay, what else have we got in scaling? So scale settings, text, yes, we've done that. Picture, again, you can synchronize box content and attributes, but only when you're doing duplicate layout. So again, duplicate layout, synchronize box content and attributes. Of course, you can only do that in duplicate layout because that's when you're duplicating something. You can, again, you've got the same settings here, and you can set picture scale limits that you never, for example, increase the picture above, say 100%, because that would destroy the resolution, or whatever you want. You've got none boxes, which clearly have got fewer properties, and all you can do is synchronize box attributes, because a none box is content none. So the attributes can be synchronized, but others can't. Table, only table size and scale grid width. And interactivity, when you're using HTML5 documents, you can scale the interactivity. Those are on by default, and most of them, apart from the synchronized content things, are available in scaling. And of course, when you're scaling, you're not duplicating, and therefore you are not going to be synchronizing. Now, that's kind of it for adaptive layout. Very, very useful indeed. And not just for HTML5 layouts, making them in different versions, but also for print layouts. But what about this shared content stuff? Because I think this is quite interesting. So this is some text. that I want to share. And I'm going to make that big. I'm going to make it bold. And I'm going to make it bright. I'm going to make that magenta. Now, supposing I want that text over here as a kind of headline, but I also want it down here. If I go to content, I can do shared content, add item. And main title, I can call it. And I can now synchronize box attributes, yes or no, and I can synchronize content and attributes, or content only. So if I want to have that same box elsewhere, then that's very easy. I just drag it across. But if I don't want to do that, I can't change it afterwards. I'm going to have to delete that and start again. But actually what I want is to synchronize only the content, not the attributes. So in this case, I can't drag it across because I'm not synchronizing the box itself. So I'm now going to drag that into here, and it comes across with the same attributes. But if I now unbold and reduce and demagentaize, the other one stays the same. And if I begin to change this, the text will change, still synchronized, but the formatting won't. So that's really important. So I've got several options here. Let's recap those. So let's say I've got a box which is going to be, get my colors out. I'm going to have a cyan background box at 20%. 20%. So I've made that as the wrong kind of box. I'm going to make that a text box. And in that box, I'm going to have, this is some text. And I can now synchronize the box attribute, but not the content. So it'll copy it across, but it doesn't change the text itself when I change it. But if I start to change those attributes, for example, by changing the color, they change together. So very, very useful for consistent layout. Equally, I can have it set as with this one to change everything. Actually, I turn that off, changing everything. Forget that. That's why I'm just changing the. Let's create another one. We'll unsynchronize all on that one, and I'm now going to create a new one where I'm going to synchronize everything, content and attributes. And drag it across, and if I now change that box changes with it. Well, I hope that has whetted your appetite for using adaptive scaling and also for using shared content. Now, as we've seen earlier, you can actually have shared content dragged in by your job jacket. And what we also saw in composition zones is that composition zones come in into that same content panel, but they're not created in the same way. So things will appear in that panel, which are different kinds of content, but the shared content we create by clicking plus on that panel over here, that's content which is going to be shared in the way we've just described. The options for scale are scale settings here. Most of them apply, apart from those which only apply when control click or right click duplicating a layout, because it's only when we duplicate that we actually then introduce synchronized box attributes and content, or picture box attributes and content, which then cause it to be generated in this window here. Well, that is all we've got time for this week. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Martin Turner, author of Desktop Publishing with QuarkXPress 2017. I wish you happy quarking.